think the question really has three baskets: an environmental regulation basket, a labor standards and freedom basket, and a wages basket. And the first two, I think, there's really not that much to talk about, but it's not that they aren't important. That is, we all do not want those who are able to bribe governments in other countries to be able to poison people or poison the globe by turning other countries into pollution havens. And we also do not want environmental standards to be used to freeze the world distribution of wealth and to slow the rate at which those so far left behind by the Industrial Revolution get to partake in our relative wealth and keep people in other countries hungry, illiterate, and barefoot. We need to balance these concerns. The difficulties that remain are those of implementation. Similarly, we want expanding trade to be a force for opportunity rather than for oppression. We like it when expanded trade gives ordinary people a path to a better life. We don't like it. We don't like it when, say, expanded trade gives rich and powerful people in the cloud city of Stratos an incentive to round up others and rip them and their families and put them to work in the unpleasant and unsafe Xenite mines underground. As then Principal Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, Stanley Fisher, warned the great and good back at the 2000 Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City's Jackson Hole Conference, there is nothing in the International Labor Organization's principles that we cannot, and very little that we should not be eager to embrace and endorse, all of us. The difficulties that remain are, once again, those of implementation, and these implementation difficulties are extraordinarily complicated and extraordinarily difficult. Nevertheless, they are less sharp than the third basket, the trade and wages basket. And the question of trade and wages. To what extent are rich countries obligated to open their markets to poor countries when the consequence is falling wages for the poor in the rich, bearing in mind that the poor in the rich countries are often wealthier and have better opportunities than the rich in the poor countries do? To what extent do rich countries do themselves well, that is, serve their national interests, when they open up their markets to poor countries, even when the consequence is falling wages for the poor in the rich? These are very hard questions, and I won't be able to answer them in my remaining 4 minutes. But I will, however, make 4 remarks. First, between 1950 and call it 1997, trade and wages really were not an issue. We had expanded trade, we had ongoing globalization, yes, but we also had foreign trading partners that were recovering from World War II and catching up to a Depression-era backlog of unimplemented technology. They raised their own relative wage levels at least as fast as globalization enhanced their influence, and so there was no net effect of trade on wages, no link from greater openness and expansion of imports to greater inequality. Greater inequality here at home. Second, at times between 1950 and 1997, trade and wages really did become a political issue, even though it wasn't really an economic issue. Trade and wages became a political issue, say, largely as a distractor from true problems. Say, the voters in Michigan in 1985. The voters in Michigan in 1985 had substantial problems. One of them was the fecklessness of the management of the General Motors Corporation that made the Chevrolet Citation, which was the first car I bought in the 1980s, and which broke a kind of generational attachment to General Motors on my part. The second was the fact that U.S. auto and U.S. other manufacturing companies had a hard time getting capital in the 1980s because U.S. fiscal policy was deranged and a whole bunch of the money that ought to have been flowing to American industry was instead sucked up by the government. High interest rates and thus a low rate of capital deepening in the economy as a whole. Now, in this consequence, expanded trade is a safety valve. The Reagan administration's budget deficits that sucked up capital and pushed up interest rates also attracted investment from abroad, which helped to reduce and alleviate the capital shortage. but it also raised the value of the dollar and so made the goods Michigan made uncompetitive on world markets. But the voters of Michigan did not really want to hear that the problems were homegrown in management on the one hand and in Washington on the other. They wanted instead to hear that the Japanese were doing something clever but illegitimate. Third, since 1997 or so, the link between expanded imports and wage inequality has become very real, as our imports now embody a much larger amount of factors competing with our own lesser skilled workers than they used to. How large? I was hoping at this point to quote from Paul Krugman of Princeton, who is right now writing a paper for the Brookings Institution looking at this question. The problem is that in the first draft, at least, Paul essentially throws up his hands at the question and says he thinks the effect is substantial but does not know, because changes in industrial organization and in the patterns of trade over the past generation have meant that the data the government collects is no longer strong enough or comprehensive enough or detailed enough to answer the trade and wages question in a manner he finds satisfactory. But there are 2 points worth noting. A, that the effects of trade on pre-tax wage inequality, they're smaller than the effects of changes in the tax system that we undergo every decade, that we implement every decade, on the overall distribution of wealth in the United States. And the effects of changes in trade on inequality of opportunity, they're much less than the effects of educational inequities, Carolyn Hawksby was talking about this morning, on inequality of opportunity. And this leads into part 4, my fourth point, which is that to the extent that we in the United States begin thinking primarily of trade and on restrictions of trade as a way to bring us together, to make us more of a middle-class society and economy, as a way to fight inequality, we're kind of barking up largely the wrong tree. And I think we're also setting ourselves up for extraordinary trouble late in this century, for extraordinarily damage to our long-run national security. Let me trespass on David's territory a little bit here. That is, think of it this way. Consider a world that contains one country that is a true superpower. It is preeminent economically, preeminent technologically, preeminent politically, culturally, militarily, but it lies at the edge of a vast ocean. And across the ocean to the west is another country, a country with a larger population and more resources in the long run, a country that looks in the end to be likely to supplant, if everything goes right, the current superpower. What's the superpower's long-run national security strategy? What should it be? And I think the answer is clear. If possible, the current superpower should embrace its potential successor. It should bind it as closely as possible with ties of blood, commerce, and culture, so that should the emerging superpower come to its full strength, it will to as great an extent as possible share the worldview of and regard itself as part of the same civilization as its predecessor, as the Romans to its predecessors Greeks. Now, in 1877, the rising superpower to the west across the ocean, it was the United States. The preeminent superpower, it was Britain. Today, the preeminent superpower, it's the United States. The rising superpower across the ocean to the west, that's China. Throughout the 20th century, it was, I think, greatly to Britain's economic benefit that America regarded it as a trading partner, as a source of opportunities, rather than as a politico-military industrial competitor to be isolated and squashed. And certainly in 1917 and again in 1941, it was to Britain's immeasurable benefit. Its very soul was at stake. That America regarded it as a friend and an ally. That after all, a world run by those whom Charles de Gaulle called les Anglo-Saxons is a much less comfortable world for the Britons than the other possibility. A world in which Europe was run by Adolf Hitler's Saxons, after all. Now, there is a chance, I think a good chance, David certainly knows better than I do now, that China is now on the same path to world influence that America walked 130 years ago, in which case come 2047, and again in 2071, and again in the years after 2075, America is going to need China. And I think there's nothing more dangerous for America's future national security, nothing more destructive to prosperity, than for Chinese school children to be taught in 2047 and 2071 and 2075 and after that Americans tried to keep the Chinese as poor as possible for as long as possible. We really are playing with fire here. And let me stop there.